This story is titled, My Sister's Lies Ruined My Life and My Family Disowned Me. Now they want me back. Years later, hey everyone. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Man, I've been staring at this blank screen for like an hour trying to figure out how to start. I guess I should just get into it. This is pretty heavy stuff, and it's taken me years to be ready to write it all down. So, yeah, I'm Eric, 33 male now, and this story is about how my sister, I'll call her Anne, completely destroyed my life with a lie, and what happened after that. But to understand everything, you gotta know what things were like before it all went bad. Growing up, Anne and I were super close. Like, probably closer than most brothers and sisters. Even with the 4-year age gap, we were basically best friends. I know that sounds weird now, given everything that happened, but back then it was just normal, you know? I was never the smart kid in school, always struggled with grades, barely passed most classes, but I was really into electronics. Not like programming or computers, more like taking things apart and putting them back together. Started with old TV remotes and radios I'd find at yard sale. By the time I was 16, I had this whole setup in my room. Soldering iron, multimeters, boxes full of circuit boards and wires. My parents thought it was weird, especially since I'd spend hours in there with the door locked. Yeah, that becomes important later. But Anne, she got it. She was like 10 when I started getting serious about it, and she'd just sit in my room for hours, watching me work. She'd ask all these questions about what different parts did, why I was connecting certain wires, that kind of thing. Sometimes she'd help me organize my parts or hold stuff while I soldered. It was our thing, you know? Our parents definitely played favorites, though. Anne was this perfect kid. Straight A's, gymnastics team, student council, the whole package. Meanwhile, I was barely passing classes and spending all my time either in my room with electronics or at the skate park. But Anne always had my back. Like this one time in my junior year, I got caught smoking behind the gym. Instead of letting me get suspended, Anne made up this whole story about how I was just holding the cigarette for someone else who ran away. Even did the whole crying thing to the principal about how I was trying to turn my life around and a suspension would ruin everything. The principal totally bought it. She helped me with homework too. She was way better at explaining stuff than my teachers. Like she'd break down math problems in a way that actually made sense to me. Probably the only reason I graduated high school TBH. I looked out for her too. Being the big brother, I was pretty protective. Maybe too protective looking back. Any guy who showed interest in her had to deal with me first. I wasn't trying to be a jerk about it, just didn't want some random dudes messing with my little sister. Even when I started getting into trouble, staying out late, hanging with the wrong crowd, Anne never judged me. She'd cover for me with our parents, make excuses when I missed curfew. One time I came home at 3 a.m. and she was sitting on the porch waiting for me. Just wanted to make sure I got home safe. Looking back now, maybe we were too close. Maybe that's why it was so easy for people to believe what she said later. But back then, it just felt normal. She was my sister, my best friend, the only person who really got me. Our parents tried to get me interested in normal stuff. They'd sign me up for sports teams or after-school clubs, but I always went back to my electronics. They thought I was wasting my time, but Anne would defend me. He's good at it, she'd say. Let him do what he loves. That's the Anne I try to remember sometimes. The little sister who believed in me when nobody else did. The one who'd bring me snacks while I was working on projects. Who'd defend me to our parents. Who trusted me enough to come to me with her problems. Fuck, this is harder to write than I thought it would be. When everything started falling apart, I was 18, just barely graduated high school. Anne was 16 and starting to get attention from guys at her school. Being the overprotective brother I was, I did what any big brother would do. Scared them off. Not like I was beating anyone up, just made sure they knew I was watching. There was this one guy, Jake, who was particularly persistent. Senior guy, driving a fancy car his parents bought him. Typical rich kid stuff. Caught him trying to get Anne to skip class with him one day. I probably shouldn't have shoved him against his car, but come on. He was 18 trying to get my 16-year-old sister to skip school. What brother wouldn't be pissed? That's when the rumors started. At first, it was just whispers. People at Anne's school saying stuff about how weird it was that I was so protective. Then it got worse. Someone started saying the reason I didn't want other guys near Anne was because I wanted her for myself. Sick stuff like that. I remember the exact moment I realized something was really wrong. It was a Tuesday after school. Usually, Anne would come to my room to hang out while I worked on my projects, but this time, she just went straight to her room. When I knocked on her door to check on her, she told me to go away. Found her crying in the kitchen later that night. When I tried to hug her like I always did when she was upset, she flinched. actually flinched away from me. That had never happened before. She mumbled something about being tired and went back to her room. The next few days were weird. She stopped coming to my room. Stopped talking to me at all, really. I figured she was just going through some teenage phase or something. Should have known better. Then one morning, I'm working on this old radio I'd found, and I hear someone knocking on our front door. Not like normal knocking, that loud, official kind of knock that immediately makes your stomach drop. Two cops and some lady in a suit were standing there when my dad opened the door. They asked to speak with him privately first. I could hear them talking in the kitchen, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Then my dad called me down. I'll never forget the look on his face, like he was looking at a stranger. The lady in the suit introduced herself as being from CPS, said they needed to ask me some questions about my relationship with Anne. Turns out Anne had gone to her guidance counselor and told them I'd been, this is still hard to write, told them I'd been touching her inappropriately, said that's why I was always in my room with the door locked, that I made her come in there and, yeah, you can figure out the rest. She told them I'd threatened to hurt her if she ever told anyone. Said that's why I was so aggressive with guys who showed interest in her. Even said I used the electronic stuff as a cover, that the wires and zip ties in my room were for other things. My dad didn't even question it, not once, just stood there nodding as they talked, like suddenly everything made sense to him. All those hours in my room, the locked door, the protectiveness over Anne. In his mind, it all added up to something sick. I tried to explain, showed them my projects, the half-fixed radio on my desk, the boxes of circuit boards and old electronics. Tried to tell them about how Anne used to sit and watch me work, how she'd help me organize parts, but they'd already made up their minds. The CPS lady kept asking these leading questions. Did you make Anne feel special by letting her help you? Did you tell her she was different from other girls? Everything I said just made it sound worse. When they asked about the time I pushed Jake, Anne had twisted that too. Said I was jealous because she was starting to like other guys, that I couldn't handle her growing up and having normal relationships because it meant losing control over her. The worst part? She had this whole story about how I'd started getting more aggressive lately because she was pulling away from me, how I'd told her she was betraying me by talking to other guys. None of it was true, but the way she told it, even I almost believed. And then I lost it, right there in front of everyone. Anne, what the hell are you saying? My voice cracked, not from anger, but from sheer disbelief. She wouldn't look at me. Anne, look at me. She kept her eyes on the floor, arms wrapped around herself like she was some fragile little thing that needed protection. That little act just made me angrier. You know this isn't true. You know it. I turned to our dad, desperate. Dad, come on. You know me. I would never... Stop. His voice was low, steady, but his face, I'd never seen him look at me like that before. Not disappointed, not angry, just done. You don't even want to hear me out? I took a step forward, but he put his hand up like I was some kind of threat. Anne flinched. She flinched. That was it. That was when I knew. You can't seriously believe this. My voice dropped. All the fight suddenly drained out of me. I looked at Anne again. Really looked at her. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. Why are you doing this? I whispered. She finally looked up. She was going to say something. Maybe even take it all back. But then she glanced at Dad, at the CPS lady, at the cop standing in our living room. And that's when she doubled down. Her eyes filled with tears. She took a shaky breath and whispered, I'm sorry, Eric. And right then, I understood. She wasn't going to take it back. Because it was too late. Because she was in too deep. Because she was scared of the consequences. I laughed. Actually laughed. Wow, I said. You're really doing this. You're actually doing this. Anne squeezed her arms around herself tighter. I just couldn't keep it in anymore. Dad clenched his jaw. Get your things. We're going to the station. And that was it. No trial. No evidence. No real questions. Just my dad driving me to the police station in silence, like I was already guilty. Like I was a stranger. Like I wasn't his son anymore. On the way to the police station, all I could think about was how they made it all fit. The lonely older brother who spent all his time alone in his room. The weird hobby with all the tools and wires. The aggressive protectiveness. The close relationship that suddenly turned bad. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. The interview room at the police station was exactly like you see in movies. They left me sitting there for what felt like hours before two detectives came in. The male detective, Rivers, played good cop, kept saying stuff like, we just want to understand what happened, Eric. Help us help you. The female detective, don't remember her name, just sat there taking notes and giving me these looks like I was dirt. Rivers started going through my electronics hobby. Tell me about the things you build, he said, trying to sound interested. So I explained about fixing old radios, building simple circuits, basic stuff. And Anne would help you with these projects? Yeah, she'd organize parts, hold stuff while I soldered. She liked learning about it. The female detective cut in. So you'd have her alone in your room? Door locked? Handling your equipment? That's when it hit me how they were twisting everything. Every normal thing suddenly sounded wrong. They kept pushing about the locked door. I locked it because I had expensive tools, I tried explaining. Dad would borrow stuff and not put it back. Or maybe, Rivers said, his voice getting harder, you locked it for other reasons. They had this whole file of evidence. Anne's statement about how I'd started touching her when she was 12, right when she started getting interested in my projects. How I used the electronics as a way to isolate her. Made her feel special by teaching her things no one else knew. I said, that's insane. She's my sister. I was teaching her because she was interested. The female detective leaned forward. Interested in electronics? Or afraid of what would happen if she wasn't? Then they brought up the Jake incident. But in their version, I'd attacked him because he was taking Anne away from me. They had statements from other kids at school about how possessive I was, how I'd scared away any guy who came near her. Rivers pulled out some photos. My room, taken that morning. They'd made it look like some kind of torture chamber. Close-ups of my tools, the wires, the zip ties I used for cable management. Even my project notes looked sinister in their photos. Your father says you'd spend hours alone with Anne in this room, Rivers said. Want to tell us what really happened in there? I lost it. Started yelling about how they were making normal brother-sister stuff sound perverted. Bad move. Rivers just nodded like I'd confirmed something. Classic defensive reaction, he said to his partner. Then they brought up my grades, my lack of friends, the hours alone in my room. Built this whole profile of an isolated, unstable guy obsessed with his... They weren't just investigating, they were building a case. And the more I denied it, the more guilty I looked. My lawyer, if you could even call her that, barely fought back. We need to consider a plea deal, she told me, as if it was my only option. If this goes to trial, you could be facing 20 years in prison. After hours of this, Rivers finally said, look, Eric, here's the deal. We have enough for charges. Serious charges. But if you work with us, admit what happened and show remorse, we can help you. I didn't do anything wrong, I said for probably the 100th time. Then explain why Anne would make this up? I couldn't, because it didn't make sense. My sister, who I'd protected and cared for, who used to wait up to make sure I got home safe. Why would she do this? The next part is kind of a blur. There were meetings with lawyers. My parents had hired one for Anne, but told me I had to find my own. The public defender they gave me was fresh out of law school and already convinced I was guilty. She told me my option. I could fight it, but she made it clear that winning wasn't likely. Juries believe victims, she said flatly. And Anne is young, emotional, and convincing. She laid out the reality. If I went to trial, I was facing a potential 20 years in prison. The plea deal was mercy, 5 years probation, lifetime registry, but no jail. If you take this to trial and lose, she warned, you won't get another chance. My own parents weren't even in my corner. Dad just shook his head. Don't put your sister through a trial, he said. Just take the deal. But I'm innocent, I said. They all say that, she replied, without looking up from her papers. They have your sister's testimony, documentation of behavioral changes, witness statements about your possessive behavior. No jury will believe you over a traumatized 16-year-old girl. My dad came to see me once before I took the deal. Hadn't seen him since he'd dropped me at the station. I thought maybe he'd finally realized the truth. Instead, he said, just admit what you did, Eric. Don't make your sister go through a trial. Dad, please, I begged. You know me. You know I'd never... He cut me off. I thought I knew you. Guess I didn't. That was the last real conversation I had with my father. 2 days later, I took the deal. Pled no contest to sexual assault of a minor. Got 5 years probation and a lifetime on the registry. Some of you might wonder why I'd plead if I was innocent. Truth is, they break you. They take every normal thing about your life and twist it until you can't even trust your own memory. And when everyone, your family, the cops, even your own lawyer, believes you're guilty, you start thinking maybe fighting is pointless. Being on the list destroys your life in ways you'd never expect. Everyone talks about the big stuff. Can't live near schools, can't get certain jobs, etc. But it's the small things that really get to you. First place I tried to rent after everything? Lady was all set to let me sign the lease. Then she did the background check. I still remember her face when she saw what came up. She actually backed away from me like I was going to attack her right there in her office. I'm sorry, she said. I have grandchildren who visit. I'm sure you understand. That became my life. People being sorry while treating me like some kind of monster. And finding work was a nightmare. Most places wouldn't even look at my application once they saw I had to check that box. The few interviews I did get usually ended the same way. We'll call you. They never did. Finally found this guy, Mike, who ran a small manufacturing. He hired people others wouldn't. Ex-cons, addicts trying to get clean. Guys like me. Pay was garbage and the work was hard. But at least it was something. Look, Mike told me my first day. I don't care what you did. Just show up on time and do your job. Worked there for almost 2 years. Then someone found out about me and started causing problems, telling other workers they shouldn't have to work with someone like me. that I was dangerous. Mike tried to stand up for me, but eventually he had to let me go. Can't risk losing my whole workforce, he said. At least he gave me decent severance pay. Lost my apartment right after that. Ended up living in my car for a while. Planet Fitness membership became my best friend. $10 a month for a place to shower and use the bathroom. Would park in 24-hour Walmart lots to sleep. Security usually left you alone if you didn't cause trouble. The worst part wasn't even the practical stuff, though. It was watching life go on without me. Through mutual friends on Facebook, before they banned me, I saw Anne graduating high school with honors, going to college on a full scholarship, meeting this rich guy Billy at some campus event. Meanwhile, I was eating cold ravioli from a can in my car, trying to figure out where I could park for the night without getting hassled by cops. Made the mistake of trying to date once. Met this girl Sarah at one of my jobs. She was nice, didn't ask too many questions about my past. We went out a few times. Things were going good. Then she asked why I always had to check the address of wherever we were going. I decided to be honest, told her about the registration requirement, how I had to be careful about where I went. Tried to explain that I was innocent, that it was a false accusation. She said she needed time to think. Next day, her brother and 2 of his friends showed up at my work. Had to quit that job too. Started hanging out at this little library branch after that. Librarian there, she kind of figured out my situation but never said anything. Would just leave books she thought I'd like on the returns cart. Lot of technical manuals, electronics books. Guess she'd noticed what I usually read. One day she caught me looking at online courses, sat down and helped me find free ones I could take. Education is everyone's right, she said. Only person who treated me like a human being in years. Started learning about cryptocurrency through those courses. Figured it was something I could do without anyone checking my background. Turned out I had a knack for understanding the technical side of it. Made a little money here and there trading. But you know what really messed me up? Seeing comments on Anne's social media. All these people talking about how brave she was, how amazing it was that she'd overcome her trauma to be so successful. She even wrote this article for her college paper about being a survivor. People were calling her an inspiration. Meanwhile, I was barely surviving. Funny how that works, right? Used to think about trying to clear my name. But who would believe me? Anne was this perfect, successful college student. I was just some creep living in his car. The system doesn't care about people like me. That's how I spent most of my 20s. Moving from job to job, place to place. Never staying anywhere long enough for people to find out about me. Never making friends because what's the point when they'll just leave once they know? Some nights I'd lay in my car looking at old family photos on my phone. Pictures of me and Anne when we were kids, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. What I could have done differently. That's the thing about being on the list. It doesn't just take away your freedom. It takes away your past, your future, your whole identity. You stop being a person and become a label. But suddenly, everything changed. It was just a normal Tuesday. I was at work, found another factory job, better than the last one, when I got this email from some private investigator. Almost deleted it thinking it was spam, but something made me read it. The PI said he'd been hired by Anne's husband Billy to look into her past. Guess she'd been acting weird lately, and Billy started digging. The PI had found inconsistency in her story about me and wanted to talk. I ignored it at first. Had enough people mess with my life already. But then he sent another email with proof he was legit. Court documents, case files, stuff I'd never seen before. We met at this diner just outside town. The PI, I'll call him Frank, had this massive folder of documents. Your sister's story is falling apart, he said, spreading papers across the table. Been doing this job 30 years. Never seen someone mess up their own lie this bad. Turns out Anne had been sloppy, really sloppy. The timeline she gave about when stuff supposedly happened didn't match school records. The witness statements from her friends, they changed every time she told the story. But what completely blindsided me was this. Remember Jake, the senior who kept hitting on her? Turns out, he wasn't just some guy sniffing around. Anne had been secretly dating him. And not just that. She got caught in his car, doing things she definitely wasn't supposed to be doing. She was convinced I was going to tell our parents about it. Maybe because she knew I'd always been protective, or maybe just out of pure panic. Either way, she needed a distraction. Something big enough, shocking enough, to make sure no one even thought about Jake. So she made up the accusations, knowing that once those words were out, nothing else would matter. Frank had texts between Anne and her friends from back then. Screenshots she thought were deleted. In them, she literally planned the whole thing. Talked about how she needed a nuclear option to keep me quiet. She didn't expect it to go as far as it did, Frank said. Reading these messages seems like she thought they'd just send you away to live with relatives or something. When your dad went full scorched earth, she was too scared to take it back. I just sat there reading through everything, seeing proof of what I'd known all along. Frank kept talking. Billy hired me because she's been acting strange lately, drinking too much, getting paranoid. He found her crying over old family photos one night. When he asked about you, she completely shut down. That's when he called me. Then Frank pulled out one last document, a signed confession from Anne. Billy had confronted her with all the evidence, and she broke down and told him everything. I need you to understand something, Frank said. This isn't going to magically fix everything. The legal system doesn't like admitting it made a mistake, but it's a start. He left me with copies of everything. Spent that whole night reading through it all. The text where she planned it. The confession where she finally admitted the truth. Even found some posts she'd made on some forum asking how to make abuse allegations more believable. The next day I called a lawyer. A real one this time. Not some overworked public defender who had already decided I was guilty. We filed for post-conviction relief based on new evidence. My lawyer said Anne's confession, combined with the discrepancies Frank uncovered, was strong enough to vacate my conviction and get me removed from the registry. It took months of hearings, but eventually, a judge ruled in my favor. My record was wiped clean. I should have felt relief. I should have felt something. But all I could think about was how long it had taken, how much I had lost in the process. A week later, an envelope landed in my mailbox. No return address, but I knew who it was from before I even opened it. My parents. The first contact in 10 years. My hands shook as I tore it open, not from excitement, just sheer disbelief. Inside was a letter, written in my dad's stiff, impersonal handwriting. They wanted to meet, said Anne had finally come clean. Well, partially. She spun some watered-down version of the truth, painting herself as a scared little girl who made a terrible mistake. No mention of the calculated lies, the years of suffering she put me through. But apparently it was enough for them to finally believe I was innocent. Tucked inside the envelope was a check, $50,000. A number that probably felt generous to them, like it could somehow erase a decade of being treated like a monster, like it could buy back my stolen years, my dignity, my life. I held it up to the light for a second, then laughed. Nothing had changed. They still thought problems could be solved with a price tag. Money wasn't what I needed. I needed the truth to be known, and I needed to hear it from someone else's mouth. So I took the number from Frank and called him. My hands were shaking when I finally dialed. He answered after a few rings, his voice wary. Billy, this is Eric. There was a long pause. Then cautiously, Eric who? I let that sting for a second before answering. Anne's brother. Silence. Then a low, humorless chuckle. That's funny, because Anne never mentioned having a brother. Never mentioned any family, actually. I swallowed down the immediate anger rising in my chest. Yeah, that tracks. Can't have the skeletons in her closet running their mouths, right? Billy exhaled sharply. Jesus. I knew she was hiding things, but this? I've been married to this woman for years, had a kid with her, and I didn't even know she had a brother? Not one she didn't completely destroy first, I said flatly. There was another pause before he muttered, unbelievable. His voice had that tight, realizing just how deep they'd been played. Then he sighed, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm. Final. I'm filing for divorce. I didn't say anything at first, just let the weight of his words settle between us. Then finally I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Good, I said. You deserve better. I hung up after that. No point in saying anything else. But as I set my phone down, a strange sense of relief washed over me. Then I found the social media posts. Anne deactivated all her accounts, but not before posting this long apology about how she'd remembered things wrong as a teenager. Made herself sound like the victim somehow. Poor confused girl who made a mistake, now bravely coming forward with the truth. Her perfect life started falling apart after that. Billy filed for divorce. The school where she worked, yeah, she became a teacher, imagine that, asked her to resign. Turns out they don't like having teachers who've admitted to making false abuse allegations. Found out later that Billy got full custody of their kid. Used Anne's confession to prove she was unstable. She tried to fight it, but Frank's investigation had uncovered other lies too. Lots of them. The real truth? She'd been lying about everything for years. Not just about me. Made up stories about other people too. Had this whole pattern of accusing guys of stuff when things didn't go her way. Some people asked why she finally confessed. According to Frank, my parents had started noticing things. Anne had been acting erratic for months, disappearing for hours without explanation, having sudden outbursts over nothing, drinking too much at family gatherings. But the final straw came when she slipped up. That was during a heated argument with my mom. She blurted something out. Something about how Eric wouldn't have suffered if Dad hadn't overreacted. My mom froze, pressed her for details. Anne tried to backtrack, but it was too late. The doubt had already been planted. My dad, ever the controlling figure, started digging. He reached out to people from Anne's past, even called her old high school friends. And just like that, the cracks in her story started showing. By the time Billy hired Frank, Anne was already spiraling, trying to patch together a lie that was quickly falling apart. So when Billy confronted her with the evidence, the texts, The inconsistencies, the proof she thought was long buried, she broke. And that's when my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was shaky, like she had been crying for hours. "Eric, please, we need to talk." I almost hung up right then. But something in her tone kept me on the line. She started rambling about Anne, about how she had finally told them her side of things, how she admitted she had made some mistakes but that she had been young, scared, confused. "She's not the same person anymore," my mother insisted. "She's broken, Eric. She cries every day. She knows she ruined your life, and she can barely live with herself." Then they actually asked, "Can't you just forgive her?" That made my blood boil. Forgive? If she had borrowed my car and crashed it, as if she had stolen some money from me, as if she hadn't stripped away my entire life, left me in ruins while she got to move on and play the victim for years. "You don't understand," my mom continued. "She's suffering now too." That was the moment I decided to meet them. Not for closure, not to rebuild some broken family bond. I wanted them to know exactly what they did to me. "Fine," I said. "Let's meet." But I already knew how it was going to end. We met at this restaurant halfway between our cities. Mom started crying as soon as she saw me. Dad just sat there looking old and broken. "Guess having your golden child turn out to be a liar does that to you?" Mom tried to hug me. I stepped back. "Let's just sit down," I said. They had this whole speech prepared about how sorry they were, how they should have believed me, how they wanted to rebuild our family. Dad even pulled out his checkbook again, like throwing money at it would fix everything. "Put that away," I told him. "I didn't come here for your money." Mom kept saying stuff like, "We were just trying to protect your sister, and we did what we thought was right at the time," making excuses, like always. I let them talk themselves out. Then I pulled out the folder Frank gave me, started reading Anne's texts out loud, the ones where she planned the whole thing. Watched their faces as they realized just how badly their precious daughter had played them. "She was scared," Mom tried to defend her. "She was just a child." "I was barely an adult," I said. "Where was my protection? Where was my benefit of the doubt?" Dad tried next. "Son, we know we messed up. We want to make it right." "Make it right?" I laughed. "You want to make it right? Can you give me back my 20s? Can you undo the registry? The jobs I lost? The people who treated me like garbage?" They just sat there, finally running out of excuses. I told them everything then. About living in my car, showering at Planet Fitness, eating cold food because I couldn't afford a place with a kitchen. Showed them the scars on my wrists from my lowest point. Mom threw up in the restaurant bathroom. For the first time in years, my parents were finally forced to sit with the truth. The undeniable proof that they had thrown away their own son without hesitation, that their golden child wasn't golden at all. I watched them sit there in stunned silence, their entire world crumbling in real time. "You did this," I said, voice steady. "You let it happen." My father looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to defend himself, but for once he didn't. He just stared at the table, jaw clenched. Mom, though, she still tried. "Eric, we were just trying to protect her. We thought we were doing the right thing." I leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "You know what the worst part is? I get that. I do. If I actually was some kind of monster, you would have been doing what any decent parents should do. But you never even gave me a chance. Not once. You decided I was guilty because it was easier than questioning Anne. And you let me rot for it." Tears streamed down her face. "We were wrong," she whispered. "We were so wrong." I let that sit for a moment. Because yeah, they were wrong. They were more than wrong. But nothing they said could ever undo what I had lost. The 10 years of my life where I wasn't a person, just a label. Mom reached across the table, her hand shaking. "Please, Eric, we can't change the past, but we're still your parents. Can we at least try to fix this?" I pulled my hand back before she could touch me. "Fix it," I scoffed. "Tell me, Mom, how exactly do you fix 10 years? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dad finally spoke. "You have every right to hate us." His voice was hoarse, aged. "But we're still your family." I shook my head. "Number you stopped being my family the moment you decided I wasn't worth fighting for." A heavy silence settled between us. They had expected anger, maybe even screaming. But I was past all of that. I didn't need to yell. They were drowning in their own guilt without me saying another word. Then, Mom played her last card. "Anne is suffering too, Eric." I stared at her. Of course she would say that. "She lost everything," she continued. "Her marriage, her career, her friends. She deserved to." I cut in, voice cold. Mom recoiled like I had slapped her. "She made a choice," I said, leveling my gaze at them both. "She lied, and I paid the price. But you," I looked directly at my father, who flinched under my stare. "You made a choice too. You believed her without a second thought. You let them take me without hesitation." Dad shut his eyes for a moment, as if he could block out the truth. Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "She's not the same person anymore." I let out a dry chuckle. "Neither am I." And that was the real tragedy, wasn't it? The person they had known, The boy who spent hours in his room fixing radios, who would have done anything for his little sister, he was gone. They had buried him a decade ago when they let the cops take me away. I grabbed the check my father had put on the table earlier, $50,000, a number they had probably pulled out of thin air, thinking money could erase what they had done. I stared at it for a second, then ripped it in half. I don't need your money, I said. I don't need anything from you. Mom started sobbing. Dad said nothing. He just sat there, like a man finally realizing he had lost something he could never get back. I stood up. You made your choice, I said quietly. Now you get to live with it. I walked out without looking back. I didn't feel anything when I left that restaurant. No rush of victory, no weight off my shoulders, just nothing. And maybe that was the real close. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew who it was from before I even opened it. It was from Anne. I stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. The letter inside was short. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. That was it. No excuses, no explanation, just that. I held it for a moment, then set it down, and I never wrote back. And yeah, life didn't magically become perfect after that. The damage had been done, and I would always carry the scars of those 10 years. But I was finally free, really free. With my record expunged, I could finally live without the weight of my past hanging over me. I moved to a new city, started fresh, built up my electronics repair business from the ground up, and I never looked back. Anne, my parents, all of it, they became ghosts of a life I had left behind. Maybe one day I'd think about them and feel something. But for now, I was finally living my life on my own terms, and that was enough.